Good morning, everybody. Hope everybody is wide awake, has their coffee or their tea, whatever food that they have for breakfast, whether it's their smoothies or cereals or whatnot. Or, of course, if you're over across the Atlantic Ocean from where I am, that you have been enjoying the welcome session just now, and also the chance to go ahead and catch up with some of our friends. I know this is odd here as we're completely virtual this year. Well, for those who are with me, I'm just giving it another minute or so as we get started. Of course, today I'm going to be talking about neurodiversity in the data platform. And of course, my focus here will be with the autism spectrum itself. And this also happens to be it's my fourth past summit, but my past summit debut in terms of speaking. Yeah, I guess some people would say, hey, you made it to the big leagues. I don't know, but it is good to be here. So I'm just giving this another few seconds as I think people are coming in. So just to introduce myself, as you see on the slide here, my name is Chris Voss, and there are my pronouns, he and him. I'm a senior database developer with Fresenius Medical Care, particularly with their child company Active Assistance Solutions, where I work on some of our medical conversions and the like. And that's part of what brought me here. This is, of course, my fourth summit. My first was back in 2013. And this is the first time I've actually gone to a summit 2 years in a row. Okay, so now that everybody, I think, is here, I'm going to keep moving. So as we see next, of course, since you're here at Summit, you can go ahead and explore everything the PASS has to offer. There's many free resources online at the PASS website. For instance, they now, of course, have the PASS Pro program for some executive training and networking. Then you have different local user groups for the groups that we have, which now sometimes present virtually. They have one-day local training events, of course, the PASS marathons, the virtual groups, which are for online for special interests. And I also would like to note that we now have a diversity and inclusion group that is getting off the ground, which I might end up having something to do with later, but no spoilers. And also, of course, our many great volunteers who help make this all possible. And there's a good chance to get involved as well. Within the slide deck, you will see links to each of these in order to know how each of these work. The marathons, the sequel Saturdays, most everything is online right now, but soon, once this passes, people have the chance to meet in person, and it's even better when we do that. Now, one key information piece for everybody, of course, the session evaluations, which you fill those out, you get prizes, and even online you get prizes. So make sure you submit those before November 20th in order to win. Just visit the session evaluation link in the left-hand side in order to rate the sessions that we have here. So with that in mind, now that introduction is done, we're going to get a little more into the presentation. Oh, all right. So this is me. This is my little icon. As mentioned, I go by he and him. I'm a senior database developer. I mentioned Fresenius Medical Care. I have my LinkedIn handle and my Twitter handle for everybody. So, of course, a little about me to start. I've basically been working with data for about 10 years now. I've started as a data analyst when I came out of college. After that, I had been an analyst, getting to work a little bit with some web interfaces, but then, of course, I started to play with SQL more and did some report writing. Eventually became more of a business intelligence database developer, got more into the realms of ETL and the like, and I sort of vacillated back and forth between the two. And eventually I've ended up both as in handle some developers at different points, and now I'm back on the developer side of things, working more with architecture and the what. And now and basically I'd like to believe that I can do at least a little bit of these things somewhat well. And I particularly love business intelligence, as I will explain a little later, for the numbers that we work with. That's why the analysis applies, but development is just seeing how it works. I live in Raleigh, North Carolina in the United States. And I also, in my free time, enjoy a good run. If you're a runner and you haven't followed the Past Sequel Run account yet, then please do so. There's little challenges that are happening every day this week, yesterday through Friday. And if you have the chance to go for a run, feel free to post. There's also a Strava group, just a shameless plug. I also sometimes enjoy a good rare vinyl record from time to time. So that's the little about me blurb that's obligatory for everybody. And with that in mind, well, today we're going to really talk about the history and the diagnoses of autism spectrum disorders and the different assets and the challenges for data professionals who are on the spectrum, what can work for them on the job, and I try to focus a bit with data, even it's generally within IT, the ways that we can help those on the spectrum and vice versa, that those on the spectrum can also help those who are neurotypical. And then, of course, I'll just be talking a little bit about some employment and employer relations as well, and companies that do have programs, just the general writing about that at the very end. Now, of course, I'm talking about this as part of many sessions that you'll see at the conference related to diversity and inclusion, including, of course, inclusive presentations later today. You'll be getting some on gender bias. You'll also be getting about mental health in general with IT tomorrow morning. And actually those three sessions of our speakers are much more accomplished than I am, but that's beside the point. I'll plug those afterwards too. So anyway, let's get to the point. Why am I talking about this? Why are we here? Well, if you're asking that question in your head, that is good. I do think I have some qualifications. Again, I have been working with data regularly for the last 10 years. It's sort of what I fell into and what I apparently have a talent for. So I kept working with data, and I've grown to love it more and more. And it's the community around me that's helped me get better as a professional. Then, of course, the autism part. I was diagnosed with high functioning autism at the age of 4. My parents noticed I really like to sort my trucks out. I really was obsessed with stacking my shapes. Took a little while to start speaking. I didn't actually know my first word until I was after age 2. And there's others that it won't be until age 3 or later, depending on the severity of autism for many. And because of some of the concerns of my development, I was part of a special education program through the end of my first grade year. And once I made the second grade at the age of 7, that's when I was taken out of special and put in a mainstream education program, though I also did have an IEP for a few years before that was completely shut out. But I was very thankful my parents fought to put me in a regular program, which there's many of us that do this, that we end up going from special ed to standard programs, and something that I'm very thankful for myself. So that's why I'm here. And especially as inclusion has become a big part of what we are trying to get going for in the world of technology and the professional world in general, it was a good time to really talk about this in front of broader audiences. So without going into the entirety of history, which I could go on forever about, I'm just going to go into a little history of autism right here. So this is only the stack slide, but just pointing out that there is some history behind it. I'm not going to go into all details about history, but plenty of what makes autism happen. So, the initial discovery, the initial time that somebody realized that this was a thing. So we begin with the case of Donald Triplett. Donald Triplett was born in Mississippi in 1933. And he was, similar to me, was more fascinated with objects than he was with people. But this was something that others, including his parents, did not understand at the time, what made him who he was. People didn't quite understand what he was doing. So he ended up taken to unfortunately, he ended up taken to a hospital on the guidance from doctors. It was the Preventorium, an institution that would prevent children at the time it was under the guise of protecting them from contracting tuberculosis. And they realized that there was maybe more to it. And the father, Beeman Triplett, wrote an account of the son's behaviors and sent it to a psychologist, Leo Connor. It does look like Canner, but it's pronounced Connor. And he eventually had a theory of the disorder. Donald Triplett was what they dubbed Case 1, as he realized in some tests when he pinched him, he would pinch him and realized, oh, this does not seem to hurt. He was able to disassociate the person. At age 5, he was able to disassociate the person doing the pinching from the actual act itself. And he also recited Psalms 23 by this point, straight from memory. It was pretty amazing. So at the time, Connor then had the chance to theorize that there were a few children with similar behaviors that had a similar disorder. They thought at the time they were dubbing it autistic disturbances of affective contact. And that was Connor's theory at the time. Over in Germany, however, Hans Asperger had his own thesis. Actually, I should stop. I've been trying to pronounce this heading into this talk, and every time I find a new way to butcher it. So I'm just going to leave the title here. So Hans Asperger, a pediatrician in Austria, he went ahead and delivered a talk at Vienna and eventually would publish this paper, his own thesis, which would be overlooked for about 35 years. We'll get into that in a little bit. Okay, so this will lead us into some more key figures and moments as we go ahead into the 1960s after Connor's descriptions. We begin with Ruth Sullivan. Ruth Sullivan is a parent who initially is a parent activist who now finds her child now has autism, as now it has become more of a thing. And she then organizes another group of mothers who will campaign for their children's access to public education to ensure that they can at least not be left behind and not be institutionalized, as we saw initially with the case of Donald Triplett, who didn't learn to drive until he was 27. Just as a side note, it took a while before he could be free, and then there's others who still were institutionalized at the time. So she became a big advocate for public education. And in 1965, she was one of the co-founders of the National Society for Autistic Children, alongside with psychologist Bernard Rimland, which of course was a group that was campaigning for children's rights for those with autism. As often, things seem to go better developmentally when you detect this as children, as we're starting to figure out. Then there was Lorna Wing. She's a psychiatrist, and also a parent of a daughter with autism. She then would eventually write the book, The Autistic Child, a Guide for Parents and Professionals. And that's where she cited Hans Asperger's work, making that more available to the public at the time. And this became, in terms of figuring out how these children act and how to go ahead and, for lack of better words, mainstream them. And then the institutions themselves were under attack anyway, as some groups and reporters started to expose some subpar conditions. The most notable was Geraldo Rivera, a young Geraldo. Before he was looking at Al Capone's safe, he was at the Willowbrook Institution in Staten Island, where they found some substandard conditions at the time. And this leads to the closing of Willowbrook and more pressure to close some more institutions. And eventually there would be one of the first statewide laws in 1974 when California Governor Ronald Reagan would sign into law a bill which committed some state education and would start closing some of these institutions as well. And this leads into more of a modern era. The first key, of course, is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which was passed in 1975. And this would, of course, originally was the Federal Education for All Handicapped Children Act, but they changed the name of this for more empowerment. So recognizing that, of course, maybe individuals with disabilities can be educated without necessarily calling them handicapped. So this was passed, and that really did help allow for more people with autism to be educated. And of course, Temple Grandin, which I'm sure that is a name that some folks do know. I know that is a name that is now more prevalent than anybody, I think, when it comes to the current spectrum. In 1986, she published Emergence Labeled Autistic, as she's been able to explain both how she came up in terms of her work with livestock and how her experience with autism allowed her to think about both her career and her social life. Of course, she is still going strong in Colorado, lecturing as a professor, but also still talking about the autism spectrum. And an example that's something I look up to myself, because she's able to balance her own professional life with being an advocate. And I'm just going to generally ask, we talk about, say, fictional characters now becoming more prevalent. So who here has seen Rain Man in this chat? Now we're going to 1988. Of course, Rain Man was based on a true story. Dustin Hoffman won a Best Actor Oscar for his portrayal of Raymond Babbitt, a man with a more severe form of autism who was also institutionalized, but now. And so on a road trip with his younger brother, as his younger brother now gets to know him and become more humanized himself along the way, after Charlie was not aware, Tom Cruise's character was not aware of him for years. And if anything, Rain Man allowed us to see, say, the savant genius of Raymond Babbitt, who was based on the real life figure Kim Peek, who Hoffman had met before filming. And then eventually that was a portrayal that some people who were not really aware of autism to really take notice, and unfortunately for the worst, sometimes stereotype them as well. That we would all be excellent drivers whose dads let us drive on the driveway. And the final point in my history that I'm going to bring up, which brings us to the title, sociologist Judy Singer, who in 1996 would coin the term neurodiversity. As Singer, she's an Australian sociologist who also found herself in the spectrum, and she explained in the dissertation that there's a movement of neurodiversity. There's different groups who neurologically are not exactly the same. And now we have this term in the 90s, and of course, more attention has been paid in the last 2 decades to autism than I have seen in my life to this point. So that's just a brief history. There is a lot more I can go into about, say, genetic research and even the vaccine connection, which I actually am not going to touch on much because that ended up being largely debunked years later. So that's intentionally why I look past that when talking about neurodiversity here. So going on, of course, about the spectrum itself. Who are the people? Why do you hear so much about it? Well, there's quite a few characteristics when it comes to many of us that have autism spectrum disorders. Our interests frequently revolve more around objects than people. We can be very fascinated, very fixated on particular things, which more so than the people themselves. We really want to see how something works, see the object, say there's a number we're fixated on, or different words we're fixated on wanting to use, or even just say, I've always liked, again, lining up all my Hot Wheels cars when I was a kid based on, say, colors, shapes, any of that. And then, of course, and then baseball cards would be similar, and how I organize my record collection too. But it can be very intense among many of us that they get obsessive. Basically, the interests that we have can be very, very obsessive. We could talk all day about them. If you want to hear about some histories of, say, the Marathon Olympic trials, or some opening and closing logos at the end of movies and television shows, oh, we can have a separate conversation about that. And it would be very long, and other people might be wondering why we're so on about it. It's really harder for us to restrain ourselves in that regard. That's why I use the word obsessive here, because we really, really love these things. Routines, creatures of habit, moving the cheese. It's something that many of us especially thrive on this, and without a routine, we feel kind of lost. It's good to develop something where it's the same. There's always been a comment about how parents of children with autism will make the same sandwich for their child every day. Or even if, say, you're an adult and decide, I'm going to go with peanut butter and jelly, but I'm going to do the same jelly. That is a freaking characteristic as well. There are some shorter attention spans quite often. Something, again, an obsessive interest can draw one's attention. Something that is a little less obsessive basically would become the dog Doug from Up, when there's a squirrel and he just turns his head and almost loses his headset. Yeah, that's how we are sometimes. That's the analogy I've always thought of is Doug from Up. Just the squirrel can get us. We're both the most and least observant people at the same time. Another characteristic that is more noticeable when younger, but also when adults, delayed speech. Now, this can vary based on the severity of somebody on the spectrum. It's a little less if they're higher functioning. As I was diagnosed, for instance, the delayed speech, it could take a little longer to say something. We don't always know exactly what to say. But say if you're more severe, it can be, as I alluded to in the beginning, the inability to go ahead and speak until as late as age 3, sometimes later, and trying to have to go through speech coaching as a result. So there often are many delays before really have a chance to speak, or sometimes tripping on words. I wouldn't say it's the same to say having a bad stutter necessarily, but it's also just a delay in knowing, hey, what do I even say here? There's the repetition of words or phrases, as in there are expressions that I want to use and I would use often. So I start to say them quite a bit. Many of us will just start repeating words we say, which sometimes we don't know the effect it may have for the good or the bad on others. And another important note, of course, the gaps in understanding body language. I don't read body language well. Many of us may not. Say if there is somebody in the spectrum who may have been at Summit previously, there might be a time where they just weren't able to quite understand when somebody was interested in a conversation or not, when you're, say, trying to get to know a person, to maybe pick their brain. Say there's something about Azure Data Factory, but they're a little busy. If it's just in the body language, but not the tone of voice, they may not understand it. And I don't want to speak for everybody on the spectrum, but it's a common trait that we don't quite get that initially. And fortunately, this leads to the next spot, that space boundaries can be hard to understand intuitively. A lot of what's expected is a given when it comes to space. It's one that unfortunately I think needs to be spelled out more with many on the spectrum. Understanding, say, how am I supposed to know versus what you are supposed to know. And I mean, there's some things that will be obvious, especially for higher functioning, but there's other cases where, say, trying to know what somebody's space is when this is their object, It's like you don't want somebody touching your stuff. Don't touch theirs, for instance. It's one that sometimes takes a little bit of coaching through. And I'll admit I've needed some of that when I was younger too. So I guess one thing a lot of people say about those who are on the autism spectrum is that they're socially awkward. So these people wonder, can people with autism make friends? I think that's a multifaceted part myself, because there are many who do want to make friends. Some actively want to make friends and just don't know how. Some, there's not really concern with friends. Even go back to Donald Triplett's story. He tended to prefer to remain in his space and would all the way through today. He's still alive and well. And many of us, including myself, we go from introvert to extrovert in the right environment. If there's anybody who knows me who's on this call, I'm somebody who sometimes stays to himself and doesn't always want to speak up immediately. But then when I'm in my moment, when I'm invited to join or somebody recognizes me and says, oh, hey, say, for instance, if sequel karaoke is a thing, then I will get on stage and try and command the room. I'm a little less nervous. We can go from, a lot of us go from introverts to extroverts if we're in the right environment where we're thriving on where we're strongest. I have a chance to go ahead and do some rap. Great. I know all the words to Big Pop. I have to do that like I do every Sunday. That's just an example, but we go from basically you can be a complete introvert and a complete extrovert at the flick of a switch, and then go back to being an introvert as well. Just saying, okay, I'm done with people, or being able to follow up. I don't always do well with keeping in touch with others because I'm not always sure how to. Some of us really are not. I mean, again, I can't speak for everybody. We have different levels of introvert and extrovert, but in the right environment, we can. So how prevalent is autism though? Well, since 2016, 1 in 68, they say on average, according to the CDC, have been diagnosed with an autism spectrum disorder when it comes to children before their teenage years. It's 1 for 42 in school-age boys and 1 for 189 in school-age girls. Originally it was thought to be more of a male thing, but it tends to be more female here. Going back just 4 years before that, in 2012, it was 1 in 140. Now it's become more prevalent. We're seeing more diagnoses, especially because, again, it is a spectrum, as Lorna Wing referred to. It is a spectrum, so we're finding more levels to understand if somebody may not be neurotypical, or even what neurotypical is at that point. Then when it comes to employment itself, there has been finding, as of 2018, that over 80% of college graduates that have autism are either unemployed or underemployed based on, say, what their majors are. And the good thing is, a lot of IT people, it's not as bad of a stat in IT. I don't have that on here as I couldn't find a verified stat based on if they were computer science or information systems majors, which I was the latter. However, there's still a stat that many do not have sufficient employment, even though they do make it to college. And unfortunately, this goes back to how this breaks down, because the rate for young Black adults with autism and Hispanic adults with autism is less than that for white adults as well. So that also speaks to, say, the different services received or recognition of autism based on one's race or their ethnicity. And when it comes to the economy, it's also recognized that those from lower income households, only 33% of those who were college graduates below the age of 30 had lower employment rates versus twice that for those with households that were upper. And just to clarify, by lower income households, I mean anyone that was under 30,000 a year, versus those who came from households that were over 30,000. So they're having some troubles with employment and not always tapping into the potential of those with autism. Now, the numbers themselves do not consider the severity of the person with it. If it's somebody who was mainstreamed, who is higher functioning, versus somebody who is more severe and has had to receive special services from the state. where for them it is much harder to find employment. All right, so now that we're at this point, we're 30 minutes in, finally time to talk about how this actually plays into the work we do in the data platform. So of course, as you see in this graph here, this is just showing what things can actually look like. Fixations, the difficulty, a lot of sensitivities. Sometimes that we all have different tics that we have, our eye contact lacking. And these are little elements that can go into how we perform on the job, especially back when we were all in offices together. I mean, I'm at the point where our office is closing and now I'm working from home permanently. So, but at the same time, if I'm on camera or need to talk to somebody, the environment changes quite a bit. There are some advantages for both your work in the field and for personal, for many of us who work with a data platform. So one of the biggest advantages is the attention to quality in terms of the data itself. They really tend to focus on understanding, say, what a pattern is and why we should go ahead and why some data may be wrong. In my case, manual quality, manual QA is something that was not my strongest suit, but anytime I'm able to automate a SQL script with it or PowerShell or some other script, it turns out pretty well, I think. So attention to quality is a very good detail because, well, detail is something we tend to fixate on even more than, say, the big picture. But it's easy for us to go in the silos. The technology adaptation. Now, this can vary based on, say, adapting to learning an entire system or how it fits. But in terms of, say, learning languages, as we'll see with many inclusive programs, learning new languages, whether learning new programming languages or why often those with autism or other spectrum disorder or any other autism spectrum disorder, they adapt to technology pretty well. Linear thinking, because again, thinking with numbers, thinking in pictures, and just knowing point A goes to point B without having to really critically think of why necessarily. That is a really big, I think that's a really big plus when it comes to hiring somebody with autism. And of course, the outstanding memory recall, not everything. Trust me, there's moments where I will forget different things around the house, but then I can always remember the dates of everything. Apparently, my wife has told me that I remember her sister's wedding anniversary before I even met her, even more than she does. It's like, hey, it's their 8th-year anniversary. It's like, we didn't even know each other then. But it's because I see it all the time in the classes and it sticks with me. And that's why we often run into, say, fictional characters who are built this way. Or say the memory and the counting that, again, Raymond Babbitt seemed to do in Rain Man with the toothpicks fall. Or how he remembers somebody's number, the same waitress's number in the phone book. On the personal end, having a narrow focus can actually be a plus. Because if there's a narrow focus, they can manage to get something done. It's like, okay, tell me the thing I need to do. Tell me, so this is what I'm going to do immediately. Allow me to do this, and it's going to be done pretty quick. Harder to do, I think, at home than it is at an office, but for some, that may be different. The sense of honesty. It can be brutal, but it can also be very good because a lot of us are less inclined to lie, and when we do lie, we're not very good at it, honestly. So that is one thing I think on a personal level that helps us out, that sense of honesty that we have with others. We're just going to tell you exactly what's on our mind, and if somebody's being sarcastic, well, we're going to go ahead and take that at face value as well. Sarcasm is one thing that doesn't always work. I guess the sarcasm science is for anybody who's watched The Big Bang Theory would speak to that. Even if personally, as a side note, I don't know if I would consider Sheldon Cooper the exact version of somebody who is on the spectrum, but more a person with some traits who don't works, but that's me off topic. And repetition, that's not really a problem. Some people get bored by doing the same task over and over. And of course, this even goes into, as Brent Ozar, among others, have noted, 1 year of experience repeated 10 times versus actually having 10 years of experience. This is more of a drawback when I say it this time, but in terms of actually getting a job done, doing that repetition and doing it over and over tends to be less boring for many of us. But also sometimes that means that there's a job that needs to be changed, they'll do it, but they're okay actually just tackling this for a bit. It doesn't seem to bother. And lastly, going back to the honesty point, there's rarely a hidden agenda. Basically, what you see is what you get with most of us that are considered neurodiverse. There's no real hidden game with many of us. Like, the only thing at worst would be using it as a crutch, but that's about it. There are some drawbacks to think about, though, with people on the autism spectrum. Within the field, multitasking is a difficult task. Multitasking, it's very hard to do. Say you get priority 1A and 1B at the same time. Ooh. Yeah, 1A, it's just hard to understand. Say you can't really get more than once. That's why I'm somebody who personally needs to go and say, okay, here's what I have as my current priorities and here's what I expect them to do. Does this sound right when talking to my boss? Then I tend to be focused. I tend to fare better when I have the chance to do that. The clarity of requirements is another big thing. If requirements are left open-ended, we're not always the best at asking how beyond just the general, okay, what's the point of this? Why are we doing this at the end? Can you clarify what is happening here? Which of course goes into how to ask questions. Sometimes there are questions to be asked. We don't know how to do that. And I wonder how many of you have gone through the experience where you're trying to ask questions, but you're not sure how to do so. You stand there and we're wondering, well, what is this question? And how does this work? Like, what is the user requirement that is part of this story here? And how is this tying to the other parts of the application that we have? So it can be very tough in terms of finding a way to ask questions and being able to ask the right person. And the learning curve, again, as mentioned on the technical side, it's good, but often the responsibility itself can affect the learning curve. Say if you're learning a new system, there's multiple parts and not just say your part that you do, can be a little harder to go up the learning curve. And if you fit, there are times I didn't fit into a job because it was hard just to understand how a system worked when it went against everything that I knew. And those things are hard to push back on. On the personal side, of course, there's communication issues. We're very long-winded. A lot of us will go on about a subject much more than anybody wants us to, and it can make us hard to deal with it off. Sometimes we're amazing to talk to. It's like, oh, wow, I didn't realize that penguins are your specialty. If anybody watched the Netflix show Atypical, because pop culture is one of the easiest gateways to reference here, penguins are a big specialty of Sam, the autistic high schooler turned college student on the show. And he can go on about that, and it actually fascinates somebody he gets to talk with, who he begins dating too. But it can sometimes be hard for anybody you work with on a regular basis. Again, because we're honest and there are no hidden agendas, navigating office politics, it's very hard to understand what allies you should make because too often it's based on surface level. I will sometimes think, oh, has this colleague been good to me or they haven't? This determines whether they like me or they don't. So these are the ones I'm going to make my allies. It's oversimplifying, but that's often how we see this. TMI, too much information. A lot of people do this in many situations. We will frequently do that because this goes back to communication issues, where we just go on, and we will not stop. Sometimes more than anybody needs to know. There's moments where we're private, and then we'll start oversharing because suddenly we can talk to somebody and the conversation's going well. Then it just leads to, say, an awkward situation where you're sharing too much of your personal life with a colleague that you really shouldn't be. And of course, getting upset about moving the cheese. Going back to the who moved my cheese aspect. Sometimes it is literally moving cheese, but personal side, any sort of disruptions are not always handled well. That actually cost me my job, my first job out of college, earlier than I was planning to leave, because there was a change in the system which I did not react to well. So that led to me pretty much being forced out about 3 weeks before I was supposed to depart, before I moved down to North Carolina from Philadelphia. Yeah, there's some of the drawbacks though with those on the spectrum. The interview process, of course, is one of the biggest hurdles as to why we see underemployment for people that are on the spectrum. So I'm going to start with one in quotes, no eye contact, because that is frequent feedback that I know I've received on some practice interviews in college, and it's one that I'd actually received before. Eye contact, again, is something that does not come easy to us because we just sort of have our eyes wander to whatever fixates us. Sometimes the eyes may wander to places that, I hate to say, but areas that they should not be. So it's one that does take some work. Giving long-winded answers. We're not always precise, even if we're rehearsed. It's only, say, a technical answer where say somebody might have to ask, okay, what is the difference between using a join and an apply? Then we can explain that based on the situation. Or say, of course, what is the essay explaining what's the difference in terms of performance if you use a like versus the substring function? And then that might seem a bit more open-ended for some of us. For instance, interview questions can be hard, even when I'm coming up with interview questions for other people I've talked to during interviews. I had to interview for I had to be one of the interviewers for a new data analyst, and I had to give some of the technical questions. And I kind of can't really say kept the balance well, so I ended up talking to the DBA and other members on how to better structure the technical questions, because they knew, it's like, well, yes, some good ones, but I'm not sure if they're either too obtuse or higher level than we're hiring for. And again, even with technical questions themselves, sometimes there's pressure. I've choked in quite a few interviews because some of us, this has never been, some of us are afraid to get something wrong. Like there was a stretch where anybody could ask me about dynamic SQL and I would just be blank because I just had no way of knowing to answer it. And if we're put under pressure, we can't always make decisions well. And that's one thing I think it's hard with technical questions, but this even goes to neurotypicals as well. But it's one that you'll frequently see with some of us that we just, we just stand still on technical questions. We just can't answer them, even if we know them otherwise. It's just being that spotlight that leads us to sometimes not be sure what to say. The applications, too often, there's a lack of help when it comes to the resumes. And while there are resume workshops, how to write a resume and how to determine what to leave things off, sometimes we need a lot more attention to resumes than other people do. I've had to go through a few sessions where people would say, okay, this part works, but here's why I wouldn't bother to look at the resume and why it wouldn't stand out. And then I've explained why. And sometimes we don't get all the help on resumes that we need to go ahead and keep them brief, even with templates. It's just ones we can't always write. And too often the networking, the onus is on those who are on the spectrum to do it rather than finding ways to reach out to create networking opportunities. And I do think this is a two-way street, but too often the network, it's actually on us to do the networking while some of us do not know how to do that gateway. We're more introverts, so I think there's also a balance on how to create an inclusive networking environment so that people can make those connections and not just as vendors be able to talk if there's an opportunity or a chance to discuss, say, a problem to expand those you know. Excellent, thank you. So with that in mind, where do many of us find ourselves? Well, many people on the autism spectrum, when it comes to data careers, there aren't as many that, for instance, are DBAs. There are some other developers, though I think that there could be a chance to be, say, a DBA or whatnot, but usually on the entry-level side, often they'll be entry professionals because the repetition, again, being able to use those. Data analysts, as mentioned, I started out as an analyst because we're the ones who can find the patterns in the data and can just keep combing through it and through it. Quality assurance jobs. Quality assurance is a big one that if it's something you're good at, often they can find themselves as QA analysts because they'll be the ones to point out, wait, this is not all it's supposed to work, as long as there's context on how it should work versus if it doesn't. Like, this is the checklist. It hits all these spots. But wait, there's one spot that's missing. Those are often where people find themselves directly out of college, thanks to different hiring programs. And then there's machine learning, the repetition of languages such as Python and R. Well, I shouldn't say the repetition necessarily, but for instance, when it comes to machine learning, I'm more of a Python fan myself because it's a bit more elegant than R is. But machine learning tends to be an area where a lot of autistic professionals are going to because of how they can repeat the sample sizes when writing out different test scripts and cases using the various libraries of each. And of course, artificial intelligence is the same. It seems like artificial intelligence versus natural human intelligence, it's often easier to work with. And there's quite a few programs that allow people with autism spectrum to start to learn more related to machine learning and even data science. It's an area I sometimes delve into, but it's not where I specialized. It's one of those, well, this is something I think I'd like to do one day type deals. But a lot of it is the talent for, of course, recognizing those numbers, plugging in formulas, and even being able to commit some elements from memory. But now I talk about how I found myself. In terms of data development, what helps me is what I'm asking. Too often you don't want to work in a silo. So I have to think about, well, maybe I have my silo where I'm most comfortable, but how does it play with, say, an application? I've worked on a couple teams, including my most recent one where it was part of an application itself. But one thing that was hard was trying to understand how to work the rest of the application. And as the person managing the database side, as the lead there, understanding how this would play with the application and knowing how these factor in, say, talking to the overall team lead or other members on knowing where this works. And like stacking objects, something like ETL was often easy because data goes from here to there. We extract it from this source, transform it, or load it, or ASELT if you're fancy and use Data Factory, which I am now too. Often we get to see knowing where data goes, and that's really helped people like me in terms of development and understanding. On the analysis end, I think what helped me as an analyst was, again, the repetition early on with report development in particular, though eventually I can't deny that I got tired of it as well because I didn't feel like I was moving even when I became a lead for reporting at one job. But the repetition of it often won't bother us to say, oh, here's the template, here's the script template. We can turn out a script. Let's go ahead and use this script, and that helps with analysis. And again, the focus on the patterns. I think that's a big one for many of us, being able to focus on data patterns. So this leads us to asking, how can we help each other across the spectrum? And as you'll notice here, Microsoft is one of the companies that has done that. So I'm just giving out what I think are some points that will be ways that we can help each other in this section. So first, I'm going to begin with the ways to help the neurodiverse employees that are around or potential ones. First thing I've noticed is just ensuring that any requirements, any technical requirements, making sure they're clear, going back to how some of those requirements can be hard to understand if we don't have a direct path. So ensuring that the requirements on a task are clear will really help to allow us to focus. That's where personally I thrive best, or most are. Say if there's somebody in the spectrum who's a consultant, and there are some out there, then it's often the idea that, well, this is what my client wants, but they've given me a clear picture. So here I go. Again, not everyone is the same, but having that level of clarity, and I know it's hard to make it a two-way street with us, but hard for us to make it a two-way street, but having that is a great first step. Once we're back in offices in particular, reducing overstimulation. Sometimes forcing everybody to be part of certain social events or sitting somebody right next to the door. There was a point where we all had offices at a previous job, but I ended up viewing the door that would go upstairs or downstairs from my desk all the time. And eventually I moved offices. I moved to the office next to that when I noted that I could always see the door opening and closing. It was a stimulant that I didn't love. So yeah, eventually after talking to my director, he said, that's a good point. So let's move you over. Once they noted that, well, if there's too much going on and there's one chance to focus, it can be just harmful. So that's reducing overstimulation, say any noises that one is sensitive to, being okay with, say, certain limits in terms of how they dress in the dress code. I'm not saying completely overhaul the dress code for anybody in particular, but say trying to work with somebody who, I know somebody, for instance, they can't wear anything with zippers. So when it comes to, so they go ahead and we're able to work with them in terms of how they do pants. The texture of zippers is one thing that bothers them. So that's basically why they always wear athletic shorts and sweats when they're casual. There's defining priorities. Again, going back to what I was saying earlier, if you go ahead and outline what priorities are and don't have too many competing priorities, that really helps go a long way. And more importantly than anything, don't make the two points for everybody. Just first off, don't make any individual who reveals themselves, I guess, for lack of better words, they are open about how they have an autism spectrum disorder. Don't make that individual test subject. It will go into, it's one where if they have something they need to talk to you about, let them go ahead and talk about where autism plays in. It's about being understanding, but don't necessarily make them the first person you go to say, oh, this experience is going to be so much different. And it goes back to, of course, when to talk to somebody and when not to. And another thing to note, office mentors would also be very good when possible to help them with the personal ends, even more than, say, the technical ends. Having technical mentors is good. I've had on my current team, for instance, I think our team lead's so good with mentoring me with some areas, but now I'm also able to mentor other members of our team to help them with their code, with the parts that I do know. So providing a mentor around the office, though, is something that we don't have enough of. And that's something that many that have been surveyed in the past have noted, having that sort of mentor would help. Just the big thing to keep in mind is that each person is unique. It is a spectrum, and it goes to classifying any group that is diverse, whether it's neurodiversity or any other sort of diversity. Inclusion means understanding that every person is unique. And that includes those of us with autism. We're not a monolith in terms of how we think, but these are ways that can help. But there's also ways those of us who are higher functioning can help others. One of the things I would recommend from my own experience, don't be scared to open up. If anything, it's actually saved me at a job before by revealing this is why I've reacted harshly to, say, somebody talking harshly at me. Revealing that this is why I was thinking a particular way on a subject. It's something where it is okay to reveal that you have it. You can't be, often the autism spectrum is one that isn't explicitly mentioned when it comes to discrimination statutes in different states, but it is one that also can count in majority of states. Unfortunately, I do not have a list on me, but it is one that they cannot go ahead and you're still protected if you are autistic, or if you have any sort of disability that's neurological. Sometimes we should be able to ask expectations if we don't know. The thing is, it's okay if you think you know. Several other times I thought I know and then realized I didn't. It's just not taking it too harshly. Because there are moments where we don't even know whether it was asked a question. We think we've got it. Sometimes we want to say we've got it. but maybe we don't, but that's okay. We're asking the expectations we don't know, but it's okay to think that you know it. So, but just make sure to try to ask whoever had given the instruction, or even talking to your manager about who should I go to about this particular task that was assigned by an external team. It depends on how you do your work. Remaining on task. I know it's kind of hard to say, hey, remain on task. Come on, like just nobody wants to be looked at necessarily. I think many of us, no matter if we're neurotypical or not, have our time somebody looking over our shoulders. But do what we can to remain focused at the task at hand, at least, even if we might be long in the conversation, can go a long way as well. I think the hard part with me for neurodiversity is knowing when that's why we stand out and knowing when not to use it as a crutch, to be able to not necessarily use autism as an excuse for, say, a particular faux pas, and being able to go ahead and apologize for it and say, and then that could be a greater conversation going, wow, my apologies, because there's some things we do not know. And maybe there's areas we're not aware of. Say if you're in an area where you grew up in a particular environment, sometimes if you're on the spectrum, it's all you know. In my case, it was a culture shock going to a rural university after growing up in a major city suburb, growing up in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, and then going out towards just southwest of Harrisburg, where it is much more rural, and knowing that not everybody quite felt the same as I did, or knowing some expectations. And that's actually what's good about, say, going to anything that discusses diversity, to be aware of our own biases and not to use those as a crutch if it comes to, say, race bias, gender bias, anything like that. And just knowing why we're different. And it can be a hard balance, and it's one I don't have the answer to in this talk, but that's the hardest part in terms of trying to help others. So as we start wrapping this up, as noted, there are companies with neurodiverse hiring programs, and I have a few listed here, and I'm going to update my slide links to even note some of these. Microsoft themselves, of course, one of our past premier sponsors, considering most of our work is on Microsoft's data platform. They are one company with these hiring programs, and it's shown some good results. I have to say it's pretty impressive in terms of the software engineers that they have hired. SAP is also one of the most notable ones around. Willis Towers Watson, Hewlett Packard, and there's even a couple that are in the Raleigh-Durham area as well for their facilities, IBM being the big one, the IBM facility that we have here. These are among the many companies that have neurodiverse hiring programs that are very easy to seek out. And again, our sponsor is one of the big ones. Basically, the best part of a neurodiverse workforce is just how the culture can change. With diversity and inclusion, bigger focal points than ever in company culture. Most of this talent may not fit into a previously established mold, and now it can be adapted for the current environment. That it's one way to know, because you especially get it in the level of communication, how people can stand out. And sometimes it is the hardest one to recognize when it comes to company culture. But it can allow people to be more honest with one another, and allow people to communicate better as teams in terms of knowing what space, what office activities might be too superficial versus what might be more legitimate. Maybe it isn't the autistic person who will say it themselves, but it's one that others might recognize at the office based on the reactions they get. Simply put, we weren't born to fit in, but to stand out. And that's really what this talk's about today. Just knowing with neurodiversity, with the data platform, how it can be an asset, but being aware of what might seem like a drawback can actually be a positive. And again, everybody can dream big, but we are born to stand out, all of us. And especially when you're somebody who might not be neurotypical. So I have some sources. I have a few articles and even 2 books that I used as references for this talk here. Ones that are worth checking out as well if anybody wants to ask me about those. And now that we're about the top of the hour, I'm ready to open the floor for any questions anyone might have with the last 15 minutes, or if anybody wants to talk a bit about, say, organizations or anything in the presentation.
Hi, Chris. We haven't received any questions, but there's been some discussion going on.
Okay.
Attendees have been mentioning the fact that headphones and earplugs have really worked for them.
Yes, that is. Headphones and earplugs, I know, have been a big thing that's worked for me as well. Say if I'm really trying to get things done, headphones and earplugs are huge. And sometimes it works, say, if you're outside, just to cancel out noise. I definitely can understand where that's going from. Headphones and earplugs are a big plus to cut everything else out, even if it's just to get rid of the noise in the back, regardless of what you're listening to.
Yes, and then there was mention of a company called Autocon, and it's in a bunch of countries and only hires autistic consultants.
Oh, really?
Yes.
That's a new one in the. Okay, that's very good to know here.
Okay, and that's what I Chris.
No, I do appreciate that. That's very good. Yeah, there are some companies that only do focus on hiring those that are autistic, and some are for, say, wage work, but there are some that are doing this for technology as they see the aptitude that others bring. So that is a big thing. As mentioned before, I will update my deck over the next day with some of the links for the companies and their hiring practices. And I'm sorry, can you say the name of the company again that was just mentioned, Cindy?
Yes, Auticon. I'll send it in the chat window.
Auticon? Okay, excellent. And we have one of the chat windows open, so. Excellent. Well, the good thing is it looks like we're Auticon. And thank you, Sanjeet. Well, the good news is looks like we're actually done a bit early when it comes to questions then. So I want to thank everybody here for joining today. Again, my name is Chris Voss. My Twitter handle is CWV, representing my first, middle, and last initials, essentially. And if there's any questions you want to email me, this is an email that you can use. And I see a question about, I will stay for any questions. So any techniques you recommend to stay focused? Now, I have not tried Pomodoro myself. One thing I'll do with browsers, I was a Chrome user for a long time, and I would use the Stay Focused extension. And sometimes I would put up the nuclear option so I didn't accidentally go to a website that I shouldn't go to. So I would filter it where I only have, say, websites directly related to my work for an hour. This way I would stay focused and on task during that period. Other elements that I will do to stay focused and goes back to the conversation about headphones, where there's a chance to, say, put on the headphones, focus on an element, because, say, there would be a particular podcast that wasn't too engaging, like, say, a podcast about a rivalry between 2 musicians that I like versus, say, listening to something about politics, as an example. And this chance to put something on in the background that can be, this is a little amusing while focused, but if it's too much, I would say the music that be on in the background should be something that is more ambient, which I think this is, or say anything that's not too heavy, that I think even neurotypicals can relate there. With staying on task, my big thing is to-do lists, though. That's the last thing I would say beyond those elements. I haven't tried Pomodoro myself, and I don't have a particular tool I could suggest. But my big thing is to go ahead and just manually handwrite. I will handwrite the different tasks I have at hand. For instance, say I've got a task list that I have right here. and then I'll use those to focus on what hours I spend doing it, and if they line up with what hours I have versus, say, meetings or anything else that comes up during the day. It can be hard for me to readjust, but it's one thing that it's been able to work for me pretty well. So I'm not sure how great of an answer that is in terms of exact techniques, but I just often keep just a paper trail of what tasks I have and allotting what time I need for this after our morning stand-up, which I have my team has a morning stand-up at 8:15 in the morning. So we have our stand-ups at 8:15 in the morning, and that's usually when I really get started after some prep right before that. And then I can have my day plotted out based on anything that may come out of stand-up or questions that someone may have. Excuse me.
Chris is saying thank you for a great session.
I do appreciate this. I hope I look forward to seeing everybody's feedback in the session evaluations as mentioned. Those are key to helping many speakers improve, including people that have spoken before, but not quite as big of a group as, say, your Pass Summit. So definitely make sure you fill those out, and also, again, swag, get to win some good prizes. And yeah, I look forward to chatting with others based on subjects throughout the day. And again, here's the contact information to reach me for both my website and here's my Twitter handle. I think early in the presentation I have my LinkedIn as well. So anybody who wants to connect, feel free to do so. Feel free to shoot any questions over my way that you have. And I would love to discuss further about personal experiences. We're all different, but we all have different questions or whatnot. Yeah, I can stay on the line for a few more minutes though, if anybody has anything else that pops up or just wants to directly message me personally. Thank you all. I hope everybody enjoys the rest of their day. There's some other good sessions on diversity. Just check out later today, by the way. Inclusion and reports with Megan Longoria at 2 o'clock. That's one I think that might help me with understanding how to be inclusive when doing presentations, different reports. Somebody who's really helped with this presentation, Tracy Bogiano, recent MVP. Tomorrow we'll be giving a talk on mental health in IT. And I think many people might need that right now. I would highly recommend attending that if you're free at 10:30. Hope I had the time right. There's a few different talks to watch about inclusion as part of Pass Summit. So definitely stay tuned to some of these speakers that are even more seasoned than I am.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you everyone for joining us at PAP's Virtual Summit. And I hope you continue to attend the other sessions.